morning, everyone. Eastern time. I know Professor Mirkay is on a very different time zone because he's joining us from Hawaii. So I'm Leandra Letterman. I'm the William W. Oliver Chair Emerita in Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. And I'm really pleased to introduce our guest speaker. Nicholas Mirkay is Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the University of Hawaii Richardson School of Law. He joined the Hawaii faculty in 2017 from Creighton University School of Law in Omaha, Nebraska, where he was a professor for 6 years and served as Senior Associate Dean for Administration and Planning. Previously, he was on the faculty of the Delaware Law School of Widener University. Professor Mirkay has received outstanding faculty awards at all of these law schools. His scholarship is focused primarily on tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, with more recent articles addressing wealth and racial inequality in tax systems. His scholarly work has appeared in a number of notable journals, including the Wisconsin Law Review, North Carolina Law Review, Northwestern Journal of Law and Social Policy, and the William and Mary Bill of Rights Journal. He's also a contributing editor to the nonprofit Law Prof blog. Professor Mirkay regularly engages in community service, advising and assisting nonprofit organizations on state formation and federal tax exemption. He has served on a number of nonprofit boards, including the Research and Institutional Review Board of the Queens Medical Center, Dignity Rights International, ACLU Nebraska, Food Bank of Delaware, and the United Way of St. Louis. Prior to entering academia, Professor Mirkay had 11 years of experience as a tax and business lawyer, including 2 St. Louis, Missouri law firms, the Office of Chief Counsel of the Internal Revenue Service, and the United States Tax Court, where he clerked at the same time that I did, actually. So we know each other from back in our tax court clerking days. Professor Mirkay has his JD from the University of Missouri Columbia and an LLM with distinction from Georgetown University Law Center. Today, he is presenting his article titled Formulating Tax Policy Through the Lens of Economic Dignity. Well, with that, let me turn it over to Professor Mirkay. So thanks so much, Nick. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for having me. I should say aloha. That's how we start everything off here, including emails. And again, thanks to Professor Letterman for having me. She's been asking me to come for a couple of years, and I've been in this associate dean role. I keep thinking it's going to end, and it's not. So I finally said yes. So I'm glad to be here. And thanks for reading and listening to the presentation. Reading the paper and listening to the presentation is a work in progress. So I'm definitely interested in comments and questions. So I thought I'd start just really briefly with how I even got to this area. So you heard in my illustrious bio, it's always a little bit more than I think, that I started teaching at the Delaware Law School, which is part of Widener University, right outside Philly. Law schools in Delaware. And 2 of my colleagues that I kind of kept in touch with after I moved on to other law schools, at some point got into this area of dignity law, which I had not heard of. And when I first got here to Hawaii, about 7 years ago, they were forming a nonprofit, which happens to be one of my areas of expertise. I do a lot of service work in there, and wanted me to help and get on the board. And they had already by that point written articles, had a case book, had a dignity project based out of the law school, where they do both litigation and other types of work, a lot of international work, really focusing on this concept of dignity as a fundamental human right that's embedded in a lot of the constitutions around the world, over 4 or 5, as we'll talk about just briefly. And as I started writing some other articles with a co-author of mine, I thought at some point, I really want to integrate this concept of dignity into tax systems. And there's been a little bit written in the international area, meaning international authors, but not so much here. And so my hope is that it's not going to sound like some utopian, pie in the sky ideal, but actually a way in which we can frame things. And so we're going to look at various issues and impacts of the current federal income tax code. Although if you had a chance at all to look at other things I might have cited, I kind of got started with this co-author of mine, a good friend of mine, because we were looking at systems, right? So kind of going up in a Goodyear blimp, as I like to say, and looking down and taking a look at the systems. And I'm not necessarily advocating a complete overhaul, but as we look at tax policy, and there's lots of both technical and policy-oriented questions, but we can also, obviously there's tons of ideological and political approaches to the tax code, which is not my intent to kind of go down that road or to necessarily take one side or the other, although it might seem like I am. And I'm also trying to acknowledge that the code has made some strides, right? There are some efforts in some of the tax credits we've talked about that are trying to address some of the systemic issues that Professor Dorothy Brown, who really introduced this area from a racial impact point of view, that some of those issues are starting to be addressed. And so the question is, can we look at things through this framework and help make other changes? So the framework of dignity really helps us look at the impact of policy choices. So our goal, right, if people agree with this goal, would be to say dignity overall is about lifting up the well-being of all people, right? And that doesn't mean that the rich people can't still be rich and accumulate plenty of wealth. But the question is the tax code itself and our tax systems, so state and local as well, are we looking at it through this dignity framework and saying, okay, is this actually lifting people up? It doesn't have to be everyone gets lifted up the same way, but are we doing in a way that does allow people to have a kind of level of dignity in which they live their lives, right? An economic dignity. And looking at the fact that the tax codes can also reflect shared successes, and that while lots of ideological viewpoints might criticize government assistance, right? Tax-funded government assistance. There are ways to look at it where in certain improvements, both in the tax code, but things that also kind of run alongside the tax code can get us to perhaps a different place. Okay, make sure. Okay, is everything advancing on the slides? Okay. Okay. So as I introduced in the paper, right, inequality has been something that's been on the minds of people for quite some time. Notice I'm starting just with inequality. A lot of times people focus on income inequality. It's the easiest to focus on because there's plenty of data out there. But wealth inequality is really the one that at least some economists, as I've quoted, say this is where our focus needs to be, right? It measures accumulation of wealth over time. It's not fluctuating income. There is progressivity in the code. So the question is not so much, is there progressivity? Should there be more? Should there be less, as some people would advocate? But the tax policy contributes to wealth inequality if the tax policy is allowing others or some or maybe more of the taxpayers to pay less tax, and then that helps them accumulate more, right? And so looking at wealth, and wealth is what we draw from to make any number of life decisions, right? The ability to save for retirement, to pay for education for our children and other family members. And so as I cite, there's definitely it's been in the context of presidential elections, right? The wealth tax has been all over the news since 2020 when certain presidential candidates introduced it as a possibility. This is not about wealth tax, but that is something that people have floated. But looking at wealth inequality in particular, it's about access to opportunities. And in that way, it's different from income inequality, right? Because wealth sustains us over time. It's not a year to year overall, like how much is income this year? Have the rates taken more or less from me? Wealth gaps are serious and persistent. I think there are many, many, many sources out there. Some that differ a lot that are consistent. But we know that wealth, especially in certain racial contexts, can lock people into intergenerational socioeconomic status. That's a big word this early in the morning for me. But, if we're locking people into a certain amount of wealth because it's hard to accumulate wealth, that kind of sticks from generation to generation. And so I set up the wealth gap as a way in which to look at, an inequality in systems, arguably. Tax policy contributes to that. And one way to maybe look at tax policy and how it affects the wealth gap is to start with the dignity of the individual. And is that dignity a way in which we can make some decisions about what is basic subsistence, right, of individuals? And how does the tax policy or tax code, both from the federal perspective as well as states piggybacking off of the federal income tax, local systems and the way they tax, are those tax systems helping or hindering or maybe having no effect on the ability of people to have a basic, subsistence level of existence? So lots of wealth disparities to think about. And I want to comment too, while my slides are going to talk a lot about the racial wealth gap, right? I mean, it's certainly an issue that has been, and this is my slide of showing you how really with the Biden administration, again, agreement or disagreement, has been focusing on this, right? Announcing first and foremost an executive order on advancing racial equality, among many, many functions of the federal government, to a Treasury working paper, which really helped me kind of move forward on this thought, because it's the first time that they've imputed race-based data to tax collection data, and tax impact data. And then the most recent budget, honestly, was helpful to me, as far as you can see, to think about, okay, are these ways that really are going to combat this issue of wealth inequality, and the way tax systems may or may not impact that? And is this a way, if we use a dignity viewpoint, to kind of make some progress? But racial wealth gap, let me be clear, also includes for lack of a better word, white people are also going to be included in that racial wealth gap, right? So it's class-based as well, right? I mean, there's a significant amount of poor working white citizens of the country. And so that is by no means my intent to leave them out, right? It's just that when we look at high income earners, the highest income earners, they are predominantly white for any number of reasons. But I don't want in any way lead you to a conclusion that there are not significant issues that maybe dignity can also help with the white working poor. And in a prior paper I did with a co-author of mine, we looked at that very issue and said, okay, guaranteed income programs, is this a way to address that issue, right? Which has some tax components to it as well. But share commonality across race and ethnicity, with respect to the fact that there's significant wealth inequality. And so I want to make sure that that's also kind of at the base of our discussion. So that said, just to get to look at it, as the paper highlights, the top 10 households, top 10%, excuse me, of households hold greater than 65% of the total wealth, and the bottom 50% hold only 2.5% of the total wealth. And again, lots of different sources on these types of figures that I'm giving, but I'm trying to use ones where I've at least been able to see mostly consistent statements. Lots of disparate effect on the wealth gap with respect across racial and ethnic lines, right? And so the Treasury report that I do talk about a fair amount does focus specifically on Black and Hispanic households, with some discussion of Asian households, but overall the disparate effect is primarily in those two ethnic and racial lines. And so while we can look at the wealth gap overall from just the percentage of our top income earners, right, versus the bottom income earners, within that view, there's a disparate impact, 5 to 6 times less for Black and Hispanic or Latino households. Some have criticized this and said this is not the right approach. We shouldn't be looking at it from a wealth inequality. This is really about poverty. But even the poverty figures are very or eerily similar with respect to the racial and ethnic impact. And so again, 9% of white households are below the federal poverty level. Now that's a large number beyond percentage because it's white households are still the largest collective amount of households in the country. So 9% is actually a bigger actual number. But 23% of Native American households, 19% of Latino households, and 17% of Black households are in that poverty or below poverty line level. So whichever way we want to look at it, right, we know we have some disparate impact. And I just added a couple other slides looking at Federal Reserve data for the third quarter, excuse me, of last year. Again, looking at household wealth in dollars, again, showing that disparate impact. Share of households overall versus share of US wealth. And again, you could find sources with some differences in that, but overall, and I'd like to think that the Federal Reserve is a good source of this type of information. And then I wanted to add in there, although it's not in the paper, but it's something I do want to at least add a comment on. And that is education has a real impact on this area, right? And I could give you other slides as well, but the lower the education level, the less accumulated wealth households show. And obviously the greater the education level, and this is across all ethnic and racial lines, the higher the education level, the higher the level of wealth accumulation is, right? So nothing else, there's a strong argument, right, that education is obviously hugely important. And while we talk a lot about tax-funded government and government investment in education clearly seems to have a positive impact on this area. And so I started off on a paper a couple years ago. Again, a good friend of mine from my Creighton Law School days, who has been a much broader writer than me, really got me into this area. And just like, I really want to look at tax systems, not like the mortgage interest deduction specifically, although I talk about it in this paper. I want to look at it from that Goodyear blimp level, right? How are tax systems, federal, state, and local overall? And again, so that kind of got me down this road, and she wanted to co-write it with someone who knew some stuff about tax. I was surprised to find the amount of data out there on state and local tax systems. So even though I've been out of everyday practice for quite some time, even when I was in practice, state and local tax was about a third of my practice in St. Louis, right? And you all are of similar Midwestern backgrounds. And so, you don't have the luxury in Midwestern cities to be able to specialize in, one area of tax. I definitely had to skate across the code a lot. But state and local tax was big and more aggressive even, 25 years ago. And so it's state systems. I was surprised at how much data there was actually out there. But one comment that I thought was really interesting by one of the commentators was, with respect to the difference between income and wealth inequality, is that the income gap provides a huge hurdle to equality, right? But wealth gap presents a mountain. Again, it is very difficult on average for someone who has been born into poverty to rise above it, right? And in part because it's hard to accumulate that wealth that others may be able to, by inheritance or otherwise, kind of start off with. Right? And I know that Professor Litterman did have you all read a few of the things from Dorothy Brown's recent book on the whiteness of wealth. Again, she has been writing in this area for quite some time, and was, maybe I would almost argue, was not at the forefront of discussion clearly for quite some time. And so in many ways, this book has helped bring that to the forefront, as I talk about. And I've had the pleasure to be in a couple conferences with her. And there are clearly as I discussed in the paper, there's clearly some data out there that shows that some of our choices of tax policy, right, our tax expenditures in particular, all congressional choice, right? Where are we going to forego revenue in lieu of tax benefits? That there's a real upside down benefit there, right? Significant amounts of benefit are increasingly going to the highest of income earners with little to no benefit to lower income earners. And with recent tax changes, right, the 2017 Tax Act to be exact, we're seeing even less impact with respect to things like the mortgage interest deduction, with any type of itemized deduction, because the changes in the standard deduction mean we're literally down to 10 to 11% of the country actually taking itemized deductions, which means any of those benefits in there are being very limited in their effect and their benefit. So again, it's not just about progressivity of rates, although, you know, that's something that clearly does, in argument, help level out some of the inequality in income. There is progressivity. The only point where I think there's a lack of progressivity is in those really highest of income levels, right? So the top rate being 37%. I mean, once you're really, really wealthy with respect to income and of course accumulated wealth, but once you reach those really highest income levels, you're at 37% and you stay there, and potentially less if a lot of your income is taxed at capital gains rates, which I talk about in the paper. So again, just to kind of to center, tax policy affects a lot of things beyond just tax, right? It affects any number of decisions. It helps make decisions on education of our children, employment, state residency, business formation, investments. All of those have a tax element to them, right? And there's at least some correlation between the more that we decrease tax, the more that it seems to increase wealth inequality, right? So if we're decreasing tax at the highest of income levels, it's adding to that wealth gap, right? Again, it's just simple math, right? You can accumulate, if you're spending less on taxes, that's more that you can accumulate. That's more that you can add to your existing wealth. Home ownership and intergenerational wealth transfers, right? So that whole estate tax issue are both things that are key drivers of the wealth gap. We'll talk a bit more about that. Now, two different areas that I talk a little bit about in the paper are actually working to narrow, and there's definite effects of the narrowing of the racial wealth gap in particular. And that's some of the tax credits, right? The tax credit and the earned income tax credit. And the expansion in particular of both of those, but especially the earned income tax credit, is showing some specific effects that are arguably beneficial, right? As far as trying to reduce this wealth gap, this inequality. And state and local tax systems have a lot of roles to play here as well, right? Now, this chart doesn't look all that starkly terrible, right, when you look at it, but you do see that the effective rate of tax overall goes down with respect to the highest of income earners. So in about 41 states, the top 1% of income earners pay lower effective tax rates than middle and low income families. And there's been some consistency to that now for a couple decades. Some of the primary reasons are reasons that flow from the federal tax treatment, capital gains preferences being a big part of that, right? If the state piggybacks off of the federal treatment, capital gains, that income from wealth is taxed at considerably lower rates, right? 15, 20%. States have also, and this is in a prior paper that I worked on, states have increasingly relied on sales tax. And so a lot of times their income tax rates have stayed flat or gone down. but sales tax has increased, right? And I think you think about the economy that we have now, the fact that, I will tell you, regardless of your thoughts on Amazon, I have a 17-year-old who's not excited that I use Amazon as much as we do. On an island, Amazon is like a saving thing, right? Because there's just so much things that actually make it here. But that said, if you think about our economy and how much we all are shopping online and virtually these days, right? The sales tax has just grown exponentially. So there's been a doubling of sales tax rates since the early 1970s, with little to no change in the income tax rates. In fact, in some cases, decreases. So kind of getting a little bit out of this data into a little bit of the touchy-feely stuff, if you interpret it that way. Clearly, our choices in tax policy, like other choices we make as a society, do reflect on our judgment as to what we consider valuable contributions to the common good, right? So this is where kind of the discussion on dignity comes into play. And economic dignity in particular, as I mentioned early on, really looks at economic resilience. And economic subsistence. Are our structures in place, tax policy and otherwise, allowing people to have a basic level of dignity in the way in which they live, right? And the economics of that. So dignity in the economic realm does force us to try to look at tax-funded government assistance, right? So you can look at that from a Medicare and Medicaid perspective, welfare obviously being a big part of that, as an investment in each other. And a couple of different recent instances are bearing out that governmental assistance, which has been long characterized as kind of, we're just encouraging continued sloths and slothful type of living to continue, right? The welfare queen, disparaging characterization of welfare recipients. That we should not be looking at that. That actually, recent data bears out that the COVID surplus payments, the increase in the impact and the availability of the earned income tax credit, and guaranteed income payments. So, which is guaranteed income being a little bit of a subset of a universal basic income. If you go back to presidential candidate Andrew Yang, again, my son was a big advocate, made me read the book. But guaranteed income programs, universal means every one of us would get some sort of government payment, right, to kind of even out the playing field. Guaranteed income payment structures have been studies across the country, usually in the poorer areas, where a payment per month of kind of a basic level of subsistence has proven to actually increase any number of outcomes of the recipients, right? Physical, financial, emotional health. And actually, it has increased those individuals staying employed, and more specifically, better employment, right? More fruitful employment. So there's, again, small projects, but some really useful data that's out there that shows government investment can actually yield positive economic results for those individuals, which then flow to the system as well. So again, I don't want to talk over time, but just to talk a little bit about dignity and human dignity in particular. As the paper discussed, this really started post-World War II, the concept with United Nations Charter, and then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both in the mid to late 1940s. And it really advanced this concept of human dignity as a fundamental, inalienable right of every person, right? We're looking, and again, I realize that if you're skeptical of this concept, right, this sounds kind of earthy, crunchy, touchy-feely, whichever characterizations you want to give it. But in actuality, it's far more embedded in the systems around the world than I would have ever given any thought to when I first even heard of dignity law. And my colleagues former colleagues who've just done a ton of work in this area. But greater than 4 out of 5 constitutions throughout the world recognize dignity as an enforceable legal right, right? And it's not just, in fact, very little of it has been discussed in the context of tax policy, but it is used for, as I mentioned, a German case on basic welfare benefits. My former colleagues have used it to argue for, fundamental, clean, and available sources of water, right? I believe Dominican Republic was a case that they handled. So this concept of dignity says, not only should we be making sure people have kind of that basic level of income, assistance, whatever we want to look at it as, to live, right, to eat, to have shelter, et cetera, it goes beyond that. And it flows from us acknowledging that we all are entitled to dignity. And it is enforceable, right, in a lot of those countries. Arguably, some have said the Bill of Rights of this country infuses implicitly some of these concepts. And then economic dignity as a subset of overall dignity, right? Which I think obviously brings in now tax policy, because taxes take away, obviously, some of our income and wealth. And so then the question is, how do we look at that policy in relation to overall economic dignity, right? And three basic prongs, and Gene Sperling has been the primary author in this area. But it is infused work. Stanford has a basic income lab, which goes towards guaranteed payments. But this concept of dignity underlies these efforts as well. So economic dignity really refers to your capacity to provide for yourself and your family a livable wage, right? So it brings in that concept. The ability to pursue purpose and potential, and the ability to work and participate in the economy with respect and without abuse or domination or humiliation, right? And that brings in any number of issues of racial and ethnicity, as well as indigenous rights across the board, right? As we look at this from a global viewpoint. And as I've already mentioned, right, then that feeds into, or necessarily sets up, this concept of looking at tax-funded government assistance as an investment in people, that it's not just that we're giving them assistance and then they're sitting there and doing nothing. In actuality, it could give people the leg up, right? It's the basic support they need to be able to get better employment with health benefits, and other supporting benefits, right, that we receive from being out there in the economy. And we need to promote that long-term self-sufficiency as contributing members of society. And as I've already said, there's been data that has bore out from COVID payments, guaranteed income payments, as I discussed, supplemental nutritional, the SNAP payments, and expansion of Medicaid and the earned income tax credit. The COVID stimulus, for instance, studies have shown that the majority of recipients used their money for food and fuel, right? So again, kind of basic economic subsistence. So boiling it further down, right? Kind of from dignity broadly down into economics, and then tax policy as feeding the economics. How do we apply it in this area? And this is not extremely well-developed area, but that's kind of why I decided to tie the wealth gap in. How do we look at this as a way in which our tax policies affect our economic existence? And part of this is also, so one is, can we start with the frame of, our tax systems provide or aid in providing or part of our analysis in determining what is a basic economic level of subsistence for every individual? part of this is acknowledging that wealth held by individuals varies across class, racial, and ethnic lines. So we have to acknowledge that when we look at tax policy, right? So for most of us, my big focus and part of the paper is on the fact of how we treat labor income or income, our wages, as to how we treat income from investments, from accumulated wealth. And we know that tax policy currently imposes more tax on our wages than it does on investment income, right? The selling of property and capital gains, dividends, and those are typically taxed at lower rates. It also looks at fair treatment of our tax systems and making sure that it's enforced fairly and equally across all lines. A recent study showed that Black taxpayers in particular are 3 to 5 times more likely to be audited by the IRS than other taxpayers of any other ethnicity. And we also know that wealth also kind of follows those racial and ethnic lines as well, right? As well as socioeconomic class. So in order to make sure that we're thinking about the dignity of individuals, we have to also think about, well, what do most individuals in this socioeconomic class hold in the matter of wealth, right? The fact of the matter is, we'll see from a few slides, homeownership is probably one of the primary ways in which everyone holds wealth, but of course it's a larger percentage, if not more of an exclusive percentage, of the lowest income taxpayers. Okay, so just to focus a little bit and again, just trying to keep to about 35 minutes on the presentation. The Treasury report that came out in January 2023, I think, bore out some revelations that many have been thinking were in existence and were there that now we can add some numbers to, right? They were able to impute race data to tax data because we don't have a tax system right now where the IRS collects racial and ethnic data from taxpayers. And I know the professor had you read some on Jeremy Bear Friend's scholarship in this area. And there's differing viewpoints, right? Some say if we start collecting that data, it can be used offensively and strategically in a way that maybe isn't beneficial. Others say it's the only way to get the clear picture. And I think there's good arguments on both sides. But based on any number of means that the paper discusses, we're imputing that data, we're imputing race, to that income tax data. And specifically, the report looks at tax expenditures and it looks at the top 8 expenditures with effects. Remember, the tax expenditures are government spending. It's the choice of government to provide these benefits which lower taxable revenue to the government, and therefore it's a decision of where these preferences, where these benefits flow. No surprise, excuse me, overall, white households benefit the most. But there are some some exclusions or some exceptions to that, and that is with the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, the effects of which are less with white families and more, again, by percentage, more across Hispanic or Latino families and Black families as well. So in that respect, some targeted tax policy is arguably having the effect, if you agree with the concept of the wealth gap and that we should address it, it is having some effect. The largest tax expenditure, as I start out with, is the employer contributions to our medical plans. And it is by far the most costly on an annual basis. But as the report brings out, that by not bringing in all the subsidies, the government gives to, federal government gives to healthcare, Medicaid, Medicare, right? CHIP, the one that's focused on children, it's really not a complete analysis. And so not a significant difference across racial and ethnic lines without folding in the other subsidies the government's putting into healthcare. So I wanted to mention that, but overall, it ended up bearing up the least amount of data. Preferential rates on capital gains is clearly a very common discussion when it comes to kind of built-in inequities in the tax system. Overwhelmingly, we see that white households, and let me back up, overwhelmingly the highest of income earners get the most benefit out of the capital gains preferences. And as I like to say to students, that's kind of a duh, right? If they hold the most wealth, then they're taking advantage of the capital gains far more than us mere mortals, right? In the more middle and clearly low income tax brackets. Also, there was a recent report that looked at the fact that in 2022, there was a real decrease in income inequality because of the market being down in that particular year. It brought down the overall income of the highest income taxpayers. So that just buttresses this conclusion, right? That if there is less income flowing from capital income, as they refer to in the Treasury report, but basically income from your accumulated wealth, if that's down because of the market, then clearly it shows that so much of the income of the highest income earners is taxed at those lower capital gains rates. So that's definitely a big contributor. And also, what kind of wealth is it that people hold based on varying levels of income, right? And what we see, obviously, is that stocks and mutual funds are mostly held by the highest of income earners, right? And the next slide, again, showing this, and I'm glad to make sure these slides are sent to you all. If you look at the top 1% being in that light gray, hopefully that shows up well. The top 1% of holders of wealth, they hold over 50% of all stock and mutual funds holdings, right? So that shows the starkness of how the bottom 90% holds very little in equity beyond just their homes, right? So extremely important for us to recognize what it is that what kinds of wealth people hold in order to determine if tax policy is effectively trying to equalize the treatment, right? So with wage earners and the amount of payroll taxes that we pay, right? Clearly, if most of us live off of the income that we make and not our wealth accumulation, then clearly we're bearing a greater amount of the payroll taxes overall, right? Because we're not holding that accumulated wealth that we can sell or earn dividends on at lower rates of tax. And in part, I was surprised when I found this, but this was based on Federal Reserve data as well. Capital was taxed less for the first time, taxed less than labor for the first time in 2018. I found that hard to believe, but they look at the taxes they're including overall on this, so it's not just income tax. But once we start looking at collectively, right, the changes in our tax systems in the last 30 years, right, we have significantly less impact of the estate tax, right, whether you agree with that or not, agree with the estate tax or not. We have shifted away from taxing wealth accumulation at all, right? We have the stepped up basis rules that allow intergenerational wealth transfers to go specifically all that gain to go untaxed. So lots of ways in which we, the country, via our tax system, have added to the wealth gap, right? Have treated wealth differently. Whereas us, again, mere mortals that earn paychecks and are primarily living off wage income, there's not a lot of ways to escape that. It's not a lot of ways to structure our portfolios to get better tax treatment. And then finally, again, without getting into lots of detail, that this is good, I think, on time. Just looking at the most recent budget proposal of the Biden administration, as a way of saying, okay, are some of these proposals ways in which we can start addressing looking at the tax policies we have in place through an economic dignity lens, right? Are there ways in which we can look at tax policy and say, okay, we have to acknowledge that the way in which we impose tax on capital gains and dividend income is much more beneficial than the way we treat wage earners under the code, at least arguably, when you look at the accumulation of taxes overall that go towards wage income. And is that affecting, or is that an arguable effect on the basic economic subsistence of non-high income earning taxpayers? So I wanted to look at a couple of the proposals because those proposals are framed in the light of trying to reduce racial wealth inequality, right? And so some of those are things that have been discussed even prior to the administration. So again, agreement or not agreement, there's been discussion of some of these issues for quite some time. So, and then as well as state tax reforms, which I did not really add to the paper at this point, but I think at least we'll draw in some of what was discussed and some other things I've published with my co-author, where some state tax reforms can help address this issue as well. So it's a lot of information to pack in, but I wanted to kind of give that introduction and some reflection of the paper here so that we can just start discussion from that viewpoint. So I'm going to leave it here with questions and discussion.